Now on to part 2 of group behavior in organizations. This time we're going to talk about the decision-making process and how group decisions succeed or fail. So let's first talk about the decision-making process, which is on the syllabus listed under the names of Wedley and Field, 1984. And if you go to the primary source material for that theory, you come across a very intimidating looking graphic. And in some of the textbooks, or at least one of the textbooks, this graphic is reproduced. And it's a lot to digest, or it's quite so intimidating you might just skip over it. There are lots of acronyms in here, but let's not get too deep into this graphic yet. Let's just first talk about the basic idea that Wedley and Field are putting forward. Essentially, what they're saying is that when people address problems or make decisions, they often do it on an ad hoc basis. They sort of make it up as they go along. It's sort of more of an impromptu way of doing things. Essentially, all they're saying is be more proactive. Plan, and not just plan, but plan the plan. Or as they say, pre-plan the process that you're going to use for making decisions. Another way of saying this is you are deciding how to decide. So what factors influence what decisions you're making about making decisions? Well, you might want to incorporate what type of interactions your group will respond to best. And I should mention that the way you decide on what interaction works best for your group will depend on some questions that are asked that are usually yes or no or closed-ended questions. So you could have individual interactions, which are face-to-face, an interacting group where committees meet. These are quite common ways to reach decisions. Or you could do something more sophisticated or less obvious, which is called the nominal group method, where you nominate people to give ideas in a round-robin fashion. And then those ideas are ranked at the end of the presentations. And the last one is something called the Delphi group method. The reason why it's called the Delphi group method, it has to do with the Greek oracle of Delphi from ancient mythology who could tell the future. And it's believed that group method decision-making processes are best for forecasting trends or things that are going to happen in the near future. And in the Delphi group method, there's no direct interaction with those people coming up with ideas, but there is a coordinator who is perhaps collecting these ideas and pushing those responsible for coming up with the solutions to problems to perhaps go further or to improve their ideas. So it's based mostly on feedback between a coordinator and a group that never actually meets with each other. Okay, there's decision-making styles. This is sort of like Business Studies 101. You got autocratic styles versus more democratic styles. But in this case, rather than using words autocratic and democratic, we're using the words autocratic and consultative. All right, and you could spend time pausing or looking at the slide for the different types of autocratic and consultative styles, or read further in your text. But there's a lot of acronyms here, so let's move forward. And lastly, there's the types of members that are within your group. Are the people in your group experts? Are they coworkers, or are they representatives of a group? Are they sort of a figurehead for subgroups? So based on all of these things going back, the interaction style, the decision-making styles, and the people who you have working for you, there's a lot of combinations for how you could plan the planning. And how do you determine which ones work and which ones don't work? Well, there's sort of this questionnaire that's sort of up and down. Does the leader lack information and expertise? And if that's the case, then you're going to eliminate using the A1 style. So what does that mean? So if the leader needs to rely on others to get information, then he can't be sort of like this old school boss where he's making all the decisions. He can't be autocratic. He has to be more consultative. So again, it's based on what type of styles you eliminate, and whatever's left over is the style that you use. So just do one more example. The leader lacks information and expertise, and the problem is unstructured. Well, if it's an unstructured problem, you're also going to get rid of consulting style 1, where you consult individually with each person. You need to bring people all together within a group to establish more of a structure. You could, try to get your head around this, how this system works, but it looks like a heck of a lot of work to decide what your decision-making process is going to be based on these yes or no questions. The situational questions are pictured to the left here in the yellow box. Now, this is a computerized model, so don't think that you're going to have to administer some sort of complex psychometric tool or some sort of self-report tool or some sort of inventory. It can be done using these sort of computerized algorithms, I guess you can call them, that determine what leadership or decision-making style works best for your given situation. So in a weird way, by deciding the planning process, you're planning to plan by filling out this questionnaire. Your desire to actually have the structure laid out for your organization requires a lot of proactivity from the person who's trying to coordinate a project. I don't know if I'm making much sense to myself right now, but let's move on to something that's a bit more easy to understand. So far we've talked about how decisions might be reached, but what might be more interesting for people is how those decisions go awry, what kind of mistakes people make, why do terrible things happen under the supervision of a well-trained staff. So let's talk about something known as groupthink. And this was first proposed, I think, by somebody before Irving Janis, but it was popularized by the psychologist named Irving Janis, who said that the need for group cohesion, what keeps people together in a group, is so strong that it could actually lead to some disasters. Okay, speaking of disasters, I just had to pause the video because somebody walked into my classroom. Put simply, the main idea of groupthink is that the desire to keep the group happy overwhelms your personal doubts or disagreements with some of the group's decisions. So maybe you remain quiet even though you have some concerns about where the group is going, or maybe there's some safety problems. Now, Irving Janis wrote his initial ideas about groupthink in Psychology Today in a 1971 edition. And it's unusual that we would actually look at mass media in psychology, because usually we look at things that were published in academic journals. But he did go on to also publish his ideas in academic journals as well. But this is sort of the origin point for the research. And he uses a lot of examples that would be more relevant for readers back in the 70s than perhaps today. So a lot of these real-world correlations or real-world analogs to what he's saying are based on recent history. Again, let me just make sure we understand what groupthink is. He uses a kind of more complicated way of putting it than we put it in the previous slide. It's when people engage in concurrence seeking, and it becomes so dominant in a cohesive in-group that it tends to override realistic appraisal of alternative courses of action. So again, to put it in more layman terms, the need for harmony overwhelms the need for disapproval or expressing your disapproval. So what was he talking about in this article? Well, he was talking about things like the Pearl Harbor invasion, the armistice deal signed with North Korea, the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the ultimate evacuation of Vietnam. I think if you ask your average person whether group cohesion is a good or bad thing, I think most people who work within highly structured organizations will say it's quite a good thing. And for example, here is a quote from someone named Marvin Shaw, who says that highly cohesive groups are more effective than low cohesion groups or cohesive groups in achieving their respective goals. But where Irving Janis leaves the common thought and why maybe his ideas about groupthink are kind of revolutionary, because he challenges the notion that cohesiveness is a virtue. it could actually get in the way of making sound decisions. The more amiability or friendliness and esprit de corps among members of policy-making in-group, the greater is the danger that independent critical thinking will be replaced by groupthink. The social constraint consists of the members' strong wish to preserve the harmony of the group. Now, most people taking A2 psychology are probably teenagers, and you could probably think about situations in your life where you've actually made stupider decisions in large groups than when you're on your own. And of course, the thing that comes to mind might be things like peer pressure, or maybe taking some pill that you're not sure quite what's in it. So you don't want to be the one who kind of rains on people's parade and ruin their good time. Maybe somebody's doing something illegal and you're thinking, oh my God, this is illegal, I should probably stop this person, but everyone's laughing, having a good time. So that's how you could relate it to your own personal peer pressures. But believe it or not, this sort of desire for social ability and amiability does carry on into adulthood when you're actually in a highly structured organization or business. One of the most commonly cited examples of groupthink, as opposed to the other examples we talked about, which are mostly military, has to do with the 1986 explosion of the Challenger spacecraft. And this was a highly publicized disaster, not only because it changed the course of the space program, but because it was the first space launch where there was a civilian on board, a school teacher, and there was a lot of public interest in this space launch. And it was one of those moments in the 80s where people kind of knew where they were when they heard the news, one of those flashbulb memory type of days. The investigation into why the Challenger exploded revealed that there may have been elements or symptoms of groupthink that were occurring. There were people who did raise objections to the launch, but eventually did cave in, or according to some versions, did cave in to the social pressures of the group. Okay, we're not going to watch that video. You could watch it on your own. So why did the Challenger launch fail? Well, there were these gaskets or O-rings within the rockets that were vital for the success of the mission. And these rings were never tested in low temperatures. I believe they had never been tested below, it says here, 53 degrees Fahrenheit. And there was an engineer who did say that this was a huge mistake because the O-rings need to be flexible, and we don't know if in sub-freezing temperatures that flexibility would still exist. And so the main culprit of the explosion was blamed on these O-rings. But if we think about it in terms of groupthink, maybe the main culprit was just bad decision-making to launch that day. There was a lot of pressure from the media. They wanted to see the civilian go into space, and I'm sure that played a part in this terrible decision. There's a video here on YouTube with a documentary about groupthink that elucidates the various symptoms of groupthink that may have occurred on the day in January 1986 when the Challenger exploded. And there are 9 or 8, originally there were 8 symptoms of groupthink, and then there's a 9th one added later on, I believe. The main 8 could be categorized in 3 ways. There's an overestimation of how powerful you are. There is the pressure to conform or to be uniform with the rest of your group. And there's these closed-minded refusal to accept certain ideas. So again, overestimation of power, closed-mindedness, and pressure for uniformity. And those could be broken down even further. The illusion of invulnerability is a huge one. And the most convenient example, unfortunately, for me would be September 11, 2001. The United States had not been attacked directly from an outside power throughout most of the 20th century. As a matter of fact, when Pearl Harbor happened, I don't believe Hawaii was even a state yet. So American states or American soil being attacked from a foreign power was almost unheard of. And that sort of safety record of not being attacked might have created the illusion with the American military intelligence that we were somewhat invulnerable. Illusion of morality would be something like God is on our side, we're doing the right thing. Illusion of unanimity is when you think everyone's on the same page, even if they're quietly not on the same page. Self-censorship is you just keep your mouth shut. Mind guards is sort of a refusal to let new information in, and direct pressure to conform. We know about these kind of things from social psychology,
like the Solomon Asch experiment, where people are asked to judge the length of lines. If you don't know the Solomon Asch line experiment, you might want to Google it. It's super famous and a good example of the pressure to conform within groups. Collective rationalizations is when you sort of justify, perhaps falsely, why something is a good idea. And outgroup stereotypes is when if somebody disagrees, you sort of maybe label that person as uninformed or stupid or something of that nature. So what are some of the ways you can minimize groupthink? In my class, the students quite impressed me by employing some of the ideas from previous chapters into this chapter, where they talked about protecting the voices from below, making sure that people who are critical of the top management are not putting their lives, or not lives, their professional lives at risk. One student said you could identify the in-group using LNX theory to let those people be the main decision makers, because they'll have a more informal relationship with the leader and therefore maybe speak more honestly. Another student said we could use nominal groups so that decisions are not made all together, they're separate, and then the best decisions are ranked accordingly. So I was quite impressed that my students were just grabbing all this stuff from previous chapters or previous learning and using it in this context. Janus himself, however, has some perhaps easier things for recommending avoiding groupthink. One idea is to use outside experts or consultants that come into meetings on a staggered basis. What does that mean? It means that if you're going to have an outside expert come in to sit in on your meetings, you don't want the same person there every week, because that person is also going to become part of the group through his familiarity. So what if you didn't have the same person there every single time? He also talked about subgroups meeting separately, which goes along with what we talked about maybe with nominal groups. Groups should hold second chance meetings, all right? This is the last chance here. Are we sure? Are we sure? Are we sure? You could also set up outside groups from a different organization or outside the organization to work on a similar problem to see if they come to the same conclusion. And leaders need to adopt an impartial stance. Never begin a meeting with your preference being stated. So for example, if I said to my students, we're going to order pizza next week, you could choose any topping, but I'm hoping that you choose meatball or mushroom, all right? Even though I gave the illusion that the students could choose what toppings for pizza, I've already set my preference. So you gotta have to just be quiet as a leader. Don't show your biases or your leanings. True story, at the beginning of the year, I said to the students, you know, this is a small psychology class. You could choose whatever units of psychology we want to study. Now, secretly, I was hoping they would pick abnormal, but I gave them complete freedom. And initially, they chose organizations and consumer behavior. And I was really upset because I had never taught those two things. So I was not going to change their opinion. I just said, you know, I tried to be impartial. So I'm going to teach these two subunits of psychology without doing abnormal, which seemed weird to me because abnormal is sort of why I think most students choose psychology. But then after like a week of consumer, the students changed their mind. Thank God, made my life a lot easier. So I tried to also, as a leader, try to not show my partiality to the subordinates. In this case, would be students. All right, how do we evaluate Janus's groupthink proposals? Well, as one writer said, in order to actually test this in an empirical way, it's estimated that 7,000 willing participants would be needed. In other words, there are so many variables that in order to cover them all, you would need to have this many participants. And it seems like one of those concepts that really can't be tested anywhere but the field, though Janus did suggest that it is possible. So that's one way of evaluating groupthink. It cannot be empirically tested without incredible amount of control, but if you do that, then you're going to have a lack of some sort of ecological validity. Paul Hart also said that one problem is that people might tend to over-apply groupthink to every situation that's a disaster. So, for example, my students are looking at things like the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster, or airplane disasters or crashes, or the BP oil spill. And they're trying to see if they could apply or not apply the 8 or 9 symptoms to those disasters. So there might be some sort of tendency to overgeneralize groupthink as the culprit for any sort of disaster. So Paul DeHart here is talking about the Watergate scandal that happened during the Nixon administration, and how it's way too convenient to use groupthink as an explanation for the Watergate cover-up.
In this excerpt here, DeHart talks about how a key element of groupthink was actually missing from many involved in the Watergate scandal. In this case, what was lacking was high group cohesiveness. So that could be used as an evaluative point of one of the weaknesses of groupthink, is that it doesn't fit every situation, even when people try. All right, as I said, I have students who are investigating their own look at groupthink. So some of the examples of things they chose. Let's skip past this here. Okay, the last thing to look at are the cognitive limitations that all people or most people are capable of, and how that could also lead to poor decision making. And these cognitive limitations are outlined by Forsyth in 2006. Let me start with a very famous example of a cognitive limitation. Let's use the famous example of Linda the bank teller. And this is an example that was created by Tversky and Kahneman in the 1980s, I believe, who were two cognitive psychologists who were famous for pointing out various cognitive biases or fallacies. I'll read this entire thing here. They asked a bunch of statisticians this following question. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which is more probable? Is it more probable that 1, Linda is a bank teller, or 2, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement? Now, in terms of probabilities, one condition is more likely than 2 conditions when they overlap. So in this case, the answer should be Linda is a bank teller. But people are more concentrated on what they expect from a person who is a active, very politically active person, and so they actually choose the second answer instead. So even when you give this problem to mathematicians or statisticians, over 80% of them chose option 2, regardless of their level of expertise, whether they were novice, intermediate, or expert statisticians. And this is a fallacy or a bias or a limitation known as conjunctive bias or conjunctive fallacy. It's essentially a math problem that the subset of both happening is less likely than one happening. And this could be categorized, according to Forsyth, as a sin of imprecision. And he has 3 categories of sins. Sins of commission, which are things that you do. Sins of omission, which are things that you overlook or ignore. And sins of imprecision, sins where you make mistakes regarding information. So let's not cover all of these, because we cover all, 10 of them. Is that 10? Yeah, it's 10. If we cover all 10 of these cognitive limitations, we'll be here for quite a while. So let me just highlight one from each of the categories. So we already talked about conjunctive bias in sins of imprecision. Let's talk about a sin of commission. And this one is pretty easy to understand. The sin of commission here might be obvious in due time. So you have a man who's stranded on an island. He spent months and months and months gathering resources and building a raft or a boat to escape the island. All of a sudden, a rescue boat comes and says, "Hey man, you want some help?" Now, of course, he should say yes, but in a ridiculous situation or an extreme example of sunk cost bias, he'll say something like, "No man, I spent months finding the materials to build this boat." So he's so heavily invested in what he's already committed to that he doesn't want to
ignore or to throw away all of his hard work. And that's an extreme example, but it happens all the time when people commit to a decision, and when a better alternative appears, they're just like, well, we spend all this money and all this time, so we're going to not take the alternative route. All right? And again, this is a sin of commission called sunk cost bias. As far as sins of omission are concerned, this happens when people overlook key information, and maybe it could be due to something like confirmation bias, which is something you might have come across in talking about in AS here, where people just try to find the data that fits what they already believe. Fundamental attribution error is when you tend to look at internal attributes of a person when something bad happens, and maybe they're stupid, maybe they're lazy. But one of the more maybe mathematical or complicated ones is base rate bias, and it's complicated because of the famous examples that are available to us. It's sort of, again, a math problem. And the most famous example of this was also done by Tversky and Kahneman in researching how people make calculations that involve probability. And the famous example is the taxi cab problem. So there's a man who witnessed a hit-and-run accident involving a taxi, but there are two taxi companies in the city that we could look at. There's Green. The Green company runs 85% of the city's taxis, and the Blue company, which has 15% of total taxis. So the witness claims that the offender was driving a blue taxi. Now, this makes the search for the person who hit the man much easier because we only have to look at 15% of all the taxis. But in this experiment, or this hypothetical, they try to test the witness's reliability and discovered that he's only successful 80% of the time when trying to recreate the circumstances of the accident using random colors, whether it's green or blue. So if this were the case, we have to ask ourselves, should we use this man's testimony in court? Where the cognitive error comes into play is that I think most people would say, of course we should. He's correct 80% of the time, and there's only 15% of cars in the city which are blue. So the numbers seem to be superficially telling people, yeah, believe what the man says. But if we actually do a little bit of maths, and I'm not going to break this down too slowly because you don't need to actually do calculation here, you just need to understand the concept. Let me just quickly explain how this works. So you have 100% represented through these 100 boxes on the screen here, with 15 of those boxes being blue and 85 of those boxes being green. Now, he's correct 80% of the time, so that means that he's probably going to misidentify 3 of the 15 blues as green. Okay, so 3 out of 15 is 80%. And he's going to misidentify 17 of the greens as blue. So if we remove from the graph here everything that is identified as green, we're left with 29 blocks, 12 blues, and then these 17 misidentified as blue. So if we take into account that the majority of these blocks are actually greens misidentified as blue, then we probably shouldn't believe his testimony. And if you do the calculation here, the chances of him being correct are 12 out of 29. And if you do that division, that means there's a 41% chance that the witness is correct. So we're less than 50%. We should not believe his testimony. Now, do you have to worry about the calculation here? No, you don't. All you need to really know about base rate bias is that it occurs when people ignore information about basic trends. They ignore the probabilities. They look at the probabilities of things very superficially, just like the people who initially saw the witness said, oh yeah, he's believable, but they're ignoring the actual calculation. So to sum up, we looked at one example of a sin of commission, one example of a sin of omission, and one example of a sin of imprecision. I invite you to look at the other ones on your own. If Cambridge ever asks about cognitive limitations, it would be difficult for them to expect that you would be talking about all 10 of them. So I would say talk about the ones that are probably easier to talk about. I actually chose ones that are maybe not so easy to talk about. Of the 3 I spoke about, maybe sunk cost bias is the easiest. There's also things like heuristics. The word heuristic means a mental shortcut, and it could also mean the lazy way we think. So, for example, the availability heuristic usually means that your sense of what's going to happen in the future is based on what is immediately available in your minds. And the famous example that people like to use for availability heuristic would be something like, oh, there was a plane crash last week, so I don't want to get on a plane. Which is ironic because I think it's the safest time to fly is immediately after an airplane crash, because usually companies are much more paranoid about something going wrong. They reevaluate their safety checks. And there's also the representative heuristic, which occurs when we make associations between certain things. So, for example, if I saw a guy wearing a tuxedo, I might assume that he is wealthy. Whereas if I saw another person who was covered in tattoos, I might assume a different economic bracket for that person. It happens all the time, and it does explain to some extent why people even might be racist or have stereotypes as well. So here are the 10 of them. I didn't go over all of them, but again, just know a few so you could talk about at least one per type. So maybe know one commission, one omission, and one in precision. All right, let's stop the video here. The next video will be talking about ways to overcome conflicts in groups.